My name is Ahmed Musa, Programs Manager at the Columbia Global Center in Amman. Thank you for joining us today for a conversation on the nexus of documentary photography and human rights advocacy. We are delighted to bring you this discussion to deepen our understanding on the importance of visual narratives as captured by documentary photography and its impact. Documentary photography of humanitarian settings is not a particularly new phenomenon. Visual representations have been capturing human struggle, strife, and survival for decades. But in our increasingly hyper-paced digital era, how is photography adapting to survive? This is especially relevant for documentary photography, as it plays such an important role in creating awareness and contributing to dialogue that can lead to influence public opinion and galvanize communities. The unparalleled popularity of images allows holding space for memory and for debate, regardless of language barriers. In our region, in the Middle East and North African region, documentary photography influenced how the world understood the Arab Spring and its outcomes over the past decade. Beyond government statements and news reports, images gained unparalleled popularity as they portrayed the narratives of events directly. Iconic images can immediately generate a response collectively across the globe, such as the death of Alan Kurdi, Bouazizi on fire, or the massive crowds clustered in Tahrir Square and more. Documentary photographers are at the forefront of critical human rights issues. They are the frontline workers whose role is to provide a glimpse into the lives and events of people and places to an audience across the world who does not regularly have access to these portrayers, and that cannot be understated. Of course, there are risks, limitations, and ethical issues to consider when working in humanitarian settings. Even so, captivating imagery can connect with audiences on a human level, and it can also create conversations that lead to change. We are delighted tonight to have with us documentary photographer Moises Saman and filmmaker-producer Sara Vedat. Moises is one of the leading conflict photographers of his generation, currently based in Amman, and he is a regular contributor to several magazines such as National Geographic, Time, and The New Yorker, and to NGOs such as Doctors Without Borders, Human Rights Watch, and UNICEF, amongst others. In 2016, Moises was a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Photography, culminating in the publication of Discordia, a multi-layered visual representation of the Arab Spring. Now I would like to hand over to Sara Vedat, who will serve as the moderator for this conversation. Sara is a Jordanian journalist and producer. Over the last 5 years, she has reported and produced several programs for PBS long-running documentary series Frontline. Sara received a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism, where she focused on documentary filmmaking. Prior to working in the documentary field, she worked as a reporter at Hibr, a Jordanian-based online platform that seeks to uphold accountability through in-depth journalism. I would like to thank everyone in our virtual audience for being with us, and a special thank you to our esteemed guests. Before I hand over to Sarah, I would like to remind our audience that we are allocating 20 minutes for Q&A at the end of this webinar. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will aim to get to them at the end of this webinar. Thank you. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ahmed. Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm happy you can join Moises and I for tonight's conversation that we're going to be having about documentary photography. We're going to be talking about Moises's work in this field over the years and the role that storytelling through photography plays, both in the journalism field and also in the human rights and advocacy field. I separate those two because while many people might lump them together, they tend to be different, and we'll be delving into that more later. As someone who works on documentary films, where we have the luxury of interviews and sometimes narration to help us communicate our ideas, I tend to be in awe of documentary photographers because to me, the challenges that photographers face to find ways to engage people or move people or connect us to a faraway place feels like a great one. But when a photographer is able to do this, when they're able to communicate an emotion through an image, or when they're able to provoke questions within us, I think they succeed beyond measure. So as we get started, Moises, I'd like to ask you first about your first encounter with photojournalism. If you could tell us briefly how you got started, what captivated you back in the day about this medium, and what did you feel you could communicate with photographs that you couldn't communicate otherwise?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sarah and Ahmed, for this great introduction, and thank you to the Columbia Global Center for giving me this opportunity to speak a little bit about my work and about the topic at hand today. Well, so I sort of encountered photography, I would say a little bit late, at least later than other photographers. You know, my story wasn't one of, you know, getting a camera when I was 9 years old and that sort of thing. I mean, I had no interest growing up in art or photography or journalism, really. So in fact, I was studying sociology and in university, and that's when I first encountered photography through a teacher, actually, that became a huge influence in my life over the years. And he was a sociology professor that I had in college, and he was you know, very much into photography, and he used a lot of photography during the lectures. You know, he particularly as a way to sort of explain different, you know, movements in society, different subgroups in society. And I just found it a fascinating way to enter into these worlds that to me were completely new and unknown, you know, especially I had just moved to the United States from Spain, where I grew up, and, you know, everything was sort of new, and it was a, you know, a huge sort of moment of discovery for me. And it was, you know, it was this teacher really that that became an influence in me, and that got me interested in photography. He got me interested in current events, and I really owe it to him to sort of set me in the right path.
And so when you started out, I remember you mentioned that you started working at a local paper. And you eventually got sent to Tijuana to document stories on immigration and social issues. How was that experience for you in the early days?
Well, that came a bit after, you know, after, you know, during, while I was studying sociology and became interested in photography, then I started sort of, you know, working for the college newspaper and doing, you know, sort of getting to know really the technical part of photography, because I had no idea whatsoever. And you know, and that eventually led to a couple of internships in very sort of small regional weeklies. I went to university in California, and so I started working sort of in that area. And you know, so that I did 2 small internships that led to a slightly bigger internship at a newspaper in San Diego, and that was really my first introduction into sort of a, I would say, like a medium-sized, you know, metropolitan newspaper with offices in different parts of the area that they covered, you know. And being a paper that was so close to the Mexican border, they actually had a small bureau, a small office in Tijuana, right on the other side, on the Mexican side. And also, as a, you know, Spanish speaker, I think they saw value in having me sort of more attached to that office, and so that's how I ended up mostly spending my internship on the Mexican side, working on stories on the border, and of course that was, you know, that was the first time that I was you know, encountering this sort of you know, border issues of poverty, the contrast between both sides of the border. And it was incredible. I mean, it was an amazing experience that I think it sort of solidified my interest in social issues, and you know, it sort of it was kind of like the next step before the next step, you know. And So I was very, very grateful for that opportunity.
Moises, I want to fast forward a bit with your story and talk a little bit about how you mentioned to me when we spoke that you were very much part of the generation of photographers and journalists who were shaped by 9/11. And I mean, since we're talking about the power of images, I'm pretty sure most of us listening to this talk today, despite where we were that day, have an image in our minds of what that day looked like. I'd like to know a little bit about what your role was as a documentary photographer during that time.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that we're obviously, I think as journalists or as artists or really in any sort of field that you're in, you're very much shaped by the events of your generation. And you know, I happened to be starting out into photography around the time of 9/11. And at that point, I had moved to New York, and I was working for a daily newspaper there called Newsday. And in fact, just about a week, 10 days before 9/11, they sent me on my first assignment to the Middle East. Newsday had a bureau in Jerusalem that covered the region. And it was around that time that was the second anniversary of the Intifada in the Palestinian territories. And so Newsday sent me there. It's my first time in the Middle East. And I found myself on 9/11. I was in the West Bank. I was working in Jenin that day. And obviously that day changed my life, as it changed the life of so many people. And you know, from that moment began a sort of a journey, you know, also because of the restrictions in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you know, I was already outside of the US, so I was able to travel freely. And it was then that, you know, Newsday asked me to go to Afghanistan, because it was sort of understood that that was going to be where you know, the next phase of that story, or the American response to those attacks, where it's going to take place. So yeah, I mean, I spent basically the next 4 months, you know, in northern Afghanistan. This was, you know, I think I got to Afghanistan, I think October 1st or 2nd. And you know, of course, it was a very uncertain time. I was absolutely not prepared for that responsibility. No, I had never been in a situation of that scope, you know, where everything that was happening, it was such a huge story. It was history literally unfolding in front of you. And so it was a time of you know, sort of learning on the go. Also, it was at the time when most newspapers started working digitally, which made a huge difference in the way that we used to work, and also had a big impact in the way deadlines change, you know. So suddenly, you know, as opposed to sending your film, you know, on in some sort of way back to New York and having the picture seen like a week later, we were literally sending pictures every day, you know. And back then the technology wasn't as advanced. Obviously, it was still the very first days of that technology. So that came with a lot of technical challenges that I still have nightmares sometimes about some of the problems that we were having. But that was sort of my introduction into what became, I would say to this day, a commitment with, you know, I would say that to this day, I'm still covering stories that are in one way or another related to that moment, you know. So that's why I think that particular event really changed the, you know, the way my career went.
So your journey to Afghanistan brings two surprises. You start having to cover a new place completely, and also have to keep up with these new deadlines and expectations on on producing or delivering. How did you make sense of that? How do you cover a place when you first get there and you don't speak the language, or you have these sort of cultural barriers, and still, how do you manage to do that and still make it on time and file for the deadline?
So, I mean, of course, now in hindsight, and with the benefit of all of this time, I can say that I made a lot of mistakes, while I was sort of learning on the go, and of course, at that time I didn't quite grasp the limitations, let's say, of working in contexts where you don't speak the language, you don't really understand the culture, you've maybe read a couple of books, but you don't really grasp the how history has shaped this place, So in a way, you sort of go into a little bit of in a mode where you're just producing for the stories that the paper was working on, So I can't really say that I was thinking independently much, I think I was, I was there covering the story, working very, very closely with a writer, and in a way servicing the stories that the writer and the editors decided that were the stories they wanted to cover, and of course that changed over the years, and I'd like to think that I maybe took a little bit more control over my destiny over the years, but in those early days, it was a very much just reacting to whatever was happening, and making a lot of mistakes that hopefully I learned from over the years. Yeah.
Because you're dealing with sort of visual language, I mean, do you feel as a photographer you are able to transcend language and empathize with experiences that you're documenting? I mean, how are you able, because you kind of need to be able to have some degree of empathy, right, as you're documenting people's lives. Did you feel that came naturally at the beginning, or did it evolve?
No, I think it evolved. I mean, there's certainly a sensitivity that perhaps you try to put up front, when you're dealing with certain situations, especially in situations where there's horrible things happening. People are dying. Lives are upended. People are displaced. But again, at that early time in my career, I think I would be kidding myself if I sort of, thought that I had that sort of perspective already. I mean, I think that my job at that point, or the way that I thought about my job, was to, capture in pictures the news that were happening that day. This idea of capturing the picture that tells the story, was very important. And that, of course, all changed over the years, and as I grew older and as I gained perspective, So it wasn't much of a time for reflection. I don't think I even had it in me, if you're just sort of running on adrenaline, you're running on the fact that things are happening so quickly. And I think it took some time to start realizing that perhaps what I was seeing maybe perhaps didn't make quite the sense that in the way that it was being described in the media, perhaps, So it took a while until I started making my own reflections and my own, judgments on what I was witnessing. I mean, of course, there was still, obviously, I think there was value in what we were doing, in the sense that we were covering the news, and we were there. And that also came up, of course, with a lot of responsibility, because, we, as photographers working for major publications, we had access to quite a big audience, and so in a sense, you also had, that power to shape the narrative a little bit, and it's something that, you know, this responsibility also over the years became, you know, I became more and more aware about that.
You also ended up spending a lot of time covering another war as well, which is the Iraq War. And before we delve into that, I mean, I'd love it if you could just tell us a little bit about how it was when you first got there.
Well, it was sort of again, it was the next war, right? It was I think by that point they already called it the war on terror, which was really not a war on one particular place, but it was, you know, it was now moving into Iraq. And when that became clear, you know, the newspaper, I was still working for Newsday at that time, you know, the resources sort of shifted toward Iraq. And I was sent with the same writer that I was working with in Afghanistan. We were sent to Baghdad, you know, for the first time in 2002. We had an opportunity to go there to cover a referendum where Saddam Hussein, I think he had 103% of the vote. And then we returned on the months before the invasion, before the bombing of Baghdad, and remained there through that period.
And Iraq is a place that you end up returning to a lot. You end up covering that war quite extensively. So it's only natural to assume that you start to develop a knowledge or an opinion about what it is that you're seeing. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, did you feel like what you were seeing on the ground was being translated in your work?
Yeah, so as you say, Iraq is a place that in fact, to this day, I'm still very much engaged with the events there, and it's a place that I'm still going on a yearly basis, and I continue to produce work. I continue to cover stories there, and you know, at the beginning, I think that. You know, it was one of the first experiences where you know, you realize, or at least personally, I realized that you know, that the reasons for the Americans to be there were problematic in my particular opinion. So I felt that brought an extra layer of responsibility for me in covering that story. You know, I think that the fact that we were allowed to stay in Baghdad to cover the Iraqi side of the initial days of the war, at least signified that they were willing to listen to what was happening, as opposed to just working embedded, which was what you know, a lot of the media outlets were doing, were embedding with the American forces. So I I really understood the responsibility of being able to tell the story from the Iraqi side, and obviously not so much from the regime side, but from the civilians that were living in Baghdad, which is a major metropolitan Arab capital, and where people really, for the most part, stayed throughout some of the worst times of the war, you know, at incredible risk, and obviously with a great number of deaths and destruction. So, so I sort of found that, you know, that was the part of the story that I wanted to do. That's the part of the story that I committed to doing. And I really appreciated the opportunity to be able to continue to return, you know. Of course, there were some issues, you know, once you send the material to your editors, then, you know, sometimes it's, you know, the pictures that end up in the newspapers, or the stories that end up, the words that end up on the stories, just like, you know, journalists get edited, you know, we also as photographers our pictures are edited and there's filters of until the moment that picture runs on the newspaper. So, there was some compromises that had to be made at certain times. Sometimes I felt very strongly about certain pictures or at certain moments that I witnessed that perhaps didn't end up on the paper. Other times they did. So it was sort of a bit of a back and forth that came with, I think, the territory of working with a major publication.
I was watching this documentary actually about photojournalism a couple of months ago, and there was this quote that I came across where somebody back in the 1960s was saying that there were too many pictures in the world already. And this was like before the age of digital, before the age of the internet. And I guess it made me think of that now as you're talking, because what do you think your coverage and the coverage of your colleagues did to help shape our understanding of the Iraq War? Did you think it was necessary? Did you think it helped expose or communicate issues? Did some of those stories do good things or bad?
Well, I mean, I think that there were certain pictures that became iconic, and the interesting part, particularly in the Iraq War, is that some of the most consequential images weren't even taken by professional photographers. I'm thinking about the Abu Ghraib torture pictures, for example, that had such a powerful impact in the way I think we were understanding what was really happening, especially to a Western audience, and of course, we were out there, sort of, covering the news on a daily basis, but I can say that my work had, the impact that Abu Ghraib had, for example, so that's very interesting, and I think that in terms of high impact, sometimes are these moments that resonate, like seeing the nature of torture, in your face, something that that nobody really in their wildest dreams thought that was happening, or the Americans were capable of certain Americans were capable of doing. And I mean, of course, there was certain stories that we covered that perhaps had a little bit of influence in contributing to the discussion about certain practices that were happening, or certain sort of human rights violations, but definitely I think none to the degree of, for example, Abu Ghraib.
Right. Since we were bringing up human rights, I think I want to talk a little bit about that, because I know you've spoken about your time in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you've worked in other places for publications like the New York Times, like Newsday, journalistic outlets. But you also did a lot of work for places like Human Rights Watch or Doctors Without Borders, and their mission or their intention when they send you out to document on their behalf is different, right? Can you talk to us a little bit about that difference?
Sure. I mean, well, I think their mission is not that different. In fact, I mean, I think when they decide to produce coverage of a particular issue by hiring a photographer or a writer or an illustrator, or whatever, I think that the goal is to get the story out. The goal is to highlight an injustice and to highlight something that's happening that perhaps is not getting the attention that it should. So in that sense, I mean, it's not that different than journalism. I think what is different is the fact that these organizations have very deep relationships on the ground with the people that they work with in a way that journalists don't, you know. So in a way, I mean, it's a really privileged position to be as a photographer, to collaborate with organizations like Human Rights Watch or MSF or ICRC, because when you really, you know, because you have this opportunity to really go deep into stories, to really go deep into testimonies, into characters, into issues that you know, as a journalist, perhaps you're just sort of scratching the surface, you know. And I really can't stress enough the you know, the really deep ties that a lot of these organizations have on the ground that translate to really having special access to particular stories, you know, that perhaps as journalists we would have a harder time achieving. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. It does. And when you are on the ground doing that, when you're documenting for Human Rights Watch or and you're looking at stories that might sometimes feel really gruesome to photograph. I mean, sometimes you're dealing with issues of sexual assault, you're dealing with issues of torture. What do you do when you're covering something like this?
Well, you know, just like in any sort of work that I try to do, you know, I try to do it with utmost dignity to the subjects, you know, but there's some particular instances where you need to apply sort of an extra level of perhaps protection toward the subject, you know, particularly in situations where you're dealing with victims of torture or victims of abuse, child abuse, etc. And you know, so there's ways to you know, to work in those settings, protecting perhaps the identity of the people that you're photographing, or you know, trying to conceptualize maybe their stories in a way that affords an extra level of protection, you know. And because you really need to you know, it's of utmost importance to protect also the relationships that these organizations have worked so hard to harvest in these areas and on these issues. So there's you know, a lot of responsibility that comes with that.
Do you ever have, or does a place come to mind where it was visually challenging to photograph something or to try and get an emotion across?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's always different. It's always difficult to really grasp, you know, the level of devastation that some of these people have felt. You know, I mean, to this day, I still, you know, I still work very, very hard to try to understand what it feels to be displaced, for example, you know, which is something that most of us have never experienced and probably never will. And it's something that really keeps me on my toes in a way, you know, because you really, you know, understanding, you know, sort of the context and the reasons that lead someone to have to leave everything behind. They're just so powerful and hard to really relate to as you know, because of our own experiences. That is something that is very, very challenging, I think, you know. And the same goes for, you know, having to you know, translate the you know, the feelings of a mother that has just lost their son or their daughter, you know, things like these that, yes, you can perhaps capture drama, but really the you know, to empathize and to really translate those feelings in a way that can have an effect is extremely challenging. And to this day, it's something that I, you know, I try to work towards.
So in a way, your work matures as you mature and you start to have experiences, maybe.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think, you know, obviously as a human being also you grow and and that obviously has an effect in the way that you relate with the world, that you relate with the stories that you cover. I mean, I just a couple of years ago, I became a father for the first time. For example, just to give you an example, and this experience, fatherhood, has had obviously a huge effect in the way that I relate to some of these stories. When I deal with children, or when I'm surrounded by stories that have to do with with fathers, daughters, sons, and that sort of thing. And I think that's in relation to growing as a person, and having that ability to have a true empathy and true understanding of the issues, because you're sort of, you have parallel experiences, and I think that continues. It's something that it's a lifelong development.
I completely agree, and I think that's a perfect transition to the next point I wanted to bring up, which is that you spent a considerable amount of time documenting events that many people remember really well because of the images we saw, and that was the Arab Spring, from Tunisia to Egypt, to Libya, and eventually Syria. At this point, you're much more experienced, you're much more versed in the region than you were during your trips to Iraq and Afghanistan before. How did that change the way you documented these events? How did that change your style?
Well, by that point, I was no longer working on staff at a newspaper. I decided to quit in 2007, and partly because I felt that sort of being subject or being sort of hostage to these ever faster sort of news cycles, where I just felt a disconnect there. I didn't feel that I was really going deep into any one story. So I, by the time the Arab Spring started, I had the opportunity to work for different magazines. I was still collaborating with newspapers such as the New York Times, but usually on longer pieces where I was able to spend, more than a day working on a story. But still, I mean, there was I think a shift that perhaps started already in Iraq, but really sort of became quite evident with the Arab Spring, where I really felt that the experiences that I was witnessing. I had moved to Egypt by that point, so I was living and working in the region. So I felt that the experiences that I was having didn't really sort of relate too much to the stories that we were publishing, just to put it simply, So I began to experiment with creating more sort of layer narratives, and that's also when I started sort of experimenting with the book form, as opposed to having my work published in magazines, of creating my own narrative that perhaps was a little bit more relatable, and at least, or a little bit more honest with the way that I was experiencing what was going on, and that led to some of the work that ended up in Discordia. I was also very fortunate to receive a Guggenheim grant to continue this work and to finalize what ended up being this book. And and it was, if I had to maybe summarize how my style changed, as you put it, I think my work became more ambiguous. I mean, I think it became more layered. It became more about creating narratives over a series of pictures rather than focusing on capturing one picture that told the story. I think that, I was more interested in making photographs that perhaps ask more questions than answering them, you know. And I think that was very much along the lines of how, you know, how I was feeling, you know. I mean, I was sort of in the thick of it, but not really understanding, you know, the relationship between everything that was happening in all of these different revolutions, you know. And from my base in Cairo, I mean, there were moments where one week I was in Libya, the other week I was in Syria, you know, 2 months later I was back in Egypt. So it was a very strange dynamic of working regionally, but still in very different contexts, you know. And so this was sort of, you know, my attempt to again create, you know, more ambiguous narratives also that spoke about this, you know, this idea that I kept seeing repeated, which was the you know, how the roles of victim and perpetrator were changing, you know, who you thought were the good guys then became the bad guys and vice versa. And, you know, so I started sort of thinking around those themes and how to create I guess a language, a visual language that spoke about these, you know, these dynamics.
And when, I mean, we're looking at some of the pages from Discordia, I mean, for people who are not versed in documentary photography, I mean, the layout is intentional, right? The grouping of the photographs is intentional. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. No, of course, it's I mean, the hardest part about you know, creating this narrative is the sequencing, and that's how you start creating momentum and you know, you start creating the different sort of motions that the book takes you to, that the narrative takes you to. And yes, I mean, I think it's, you know, sort of like building a puzzle in a way, and something that is very time consuming. Working on this book, I also collaborated quite closely with an artist friend of mine that brought a particular point of view that tried to sort of move me away from the journalistic sort of DNA that I still carry, and journalistic instincts that are still very much alive in the work that I do, but at least visually, to sort of remove me a little bit and try to be a little bit more, I guess, you know, again, ambiguous and you know, think in terms of series rather than the pictures that tell one story. An example, for example, now that we have these collage, you know, this idea of experimenting with collages, you know, came from discussing with my artist friend. You know, we were talking about how to represent the hundreds and hundreds of protests that I had photographed, you know, and clashes in all of these different places. And, you know, and somehow the idea of just choosing the best action picture somehow didn't make it justice, you know. So then we became more interested in the body language, in the theatrics of you know, the movement that I saw repeated in these sort of scenes, you know, where there's a certain aesthetic to these protesters and the way that they move during these protests. So we decided to actually take the people out of to actually cut them out of the context of the larger picture and create these collages as a way to experiment with different visual languages, you know, different visual representations of you know, a story that we all saw, you know, how many pictures of these protests we were seeing every day, you know, on the TV, on the newspapers, etc.
Moises, I have a ton more questions, but I want to give a chance to people to ask their own because we have 15 minutes left. So I want to open it up, and the first question I want to ask you is from someone in the audience who is saying, who wants to know, how do you balance protecting someone's dignity while also exposing injustice?
It's it's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question to answer because this is something. It's a dilemma that we face constantly, in the field, and especially as a photographer, where sometimes you arrive to a situation, you arrive to a scene that you think can really have a particular impact if you capture it as is, without sort of, asking first, let's say, if you can take the picture or not, So a lot of times it's really about, sort of understanding if you are accepted in the situation, if your role as a photographer is understood by the people around you, by your subjects, So there's a lot of times where that is not understood, and then you really need to thread very carefully. You need to obviously ask permissions in certain situations, such as, before we saw some pictures of people sort of looking away, and that was a big a story that I did in Sri Lanka about victims of torture during the civil war there. And obviously, these were people that didn't want their identity seen. So you sort of, you need to be honest with your subjects. You need to understand, if, the context is understood of why you're there, if you're being accepted or not, So it's really, there's no formula to it, and it really varies from situation to situation. And I've experienced basically all of the different sort of spectrum of well, not all, but I've been in places where, I had to ask permission and I was told yes or no. I've been in situations where I took pictures and there was no problem, but I've also been in situations where I took a picture and I was told that, that was a big mistake, and I had to suffer the consequences as well. So I don't know if I'm answering this question well, but I think that you need to be honest with yourself as well, but first and foremost with the people and the issue that you're trying to cover.
And the next question is from Zoe, a young journalist based in Amman. She wants to know that as many outlets have cut their travel budgets and downsized international bureaus, what consequences do these changes in funding and priorities have on international journalism?
Well, aside from budgets, I think the main sort of dynamic, it's been this very strange year, obviously, with COVID, and the fact that, just to give you an example, I haven't left Jordan in almost a year now, so I think that, that had the effect of perhaps outlets relying more on local journalists or people that are sort of on the ground. There's now, I've done a few remote shoots as well, which is something that's been, I guess, interesting and quite an experience as well, in terms of, shooting your subjects via Zoom. But I think in terms of the effect in journalism, I think that the jury's still out on that. I don't know. I think it's too soon to really know what the effect of these lockdowns is. I think, in terms of budgets, I mean, the budgets have been, going down for several years now, and I think that perhaps that, like as I said, it's had the effect of perhaps relying more on local journalists, or also I think perhaps the also having to report remotely, having to report over the phone as opposed to from the ground. I mean, Sarah, maybe you can answer that as well from your perspective.
I mean, I think from my perspective, this is the first year where we've been really limited in terms of sending people out. I mean, I I've also not gone on a reporting trip in almost a year. It'll be a year in March. And the silver lining is that we have found that there are plenty of local crews and filmmakers on the ground who are capable of documenting and capturing things. And I think that's great for them. But it's that COVID has definitely sort of made us reassess how often we'll be sending people out to places. I'm hoping it comes back and the scales balance a little bit more in our favor so we can continue to travel. But I am also very happy to have connected remotely with crews in places around the world that have done wonderful work for us and to discover new talent. Because at the end of the day, what is this industry without more and more diverse voices? We only become richer with that. But I will move on to someone else's question. Hussein Amri wants to know, do you think that the rise of freelance photojournalism or journalism in general has influenced the way stories are being pushed and circulated online?
The rise of freelance journalism.
Freelance photojournalism or journalism, yes. If you think it's the rise of freelance has influenced the way stories are being pushed and circulated online.
I think absolutely. I mean, I think not just professional freelance photographers, but now anybody with a phone camera, if he's in the right place at the right time, can have a front page picture in the New York Times, or anywhere else. So I think obviously the rise of citizen journalism is a phenomenon that we've seen over the years. But I think, as freelance photographers are, covering their communities, their regions. Again, as you were saying, Sarah, I think this is also very important in terms of democratizing representation, and of having more, autochthonous voices, more voices from the places where these stories are taking place, that have the opportunity to tell their own stories, which is something that I think we need to be very conscious of, and hopefully, all of the discussions that are happening recently about these topics are extremely important. And I think that as we discussed, before, Sarah, this moment of reckoning that we're living, I think it's a great opportunity, I think, for local journalism, for local freelance photographers, and most importantly, to sort of empower people to tell the stories from their own community, as opposed to having me or somebody else come in to tell that story, if I, you know what I mean? Like, I think this is a great opportunity that should be seized.
I agree. Were there times where you would refuse the use of your photo if it was going to be edited or cropped out of concern that they'd edit out a crucial aspect of the photo? This is a question from one of our attendees.
Yes, well, I work with the people that I work with, the clients that I work with, the organizations that I collaborate with. There's, we have an understanding that the pictures that I do for them should not be cropped, and that they have to respect the way that I frame the picture, because to me, every inch of the photograph has a purpose, and so there's that understanding, and I would encourage young photographers to really seek that sort of respect as well, and to have those conversations with the editors that you collaborate with, because I really believe that the work that you do should be respected as it is, because again the way that you frame a photograph should have a reason to be, and I think that should be respected.
Brilliant. Afnan Abu Yahya is asking, how does conflict photography contribute to challenging the dominant narrative? And to what extent do you think that what you do should question mainstream coverage rather than focusing mainly on humanitarian events?
Well, that I think it's a great question. I think this also goes back to this idea of this responsibility that you have that comes with this access to large audiences. So for example, you at PBS or me, if I'm working for the New Yorker or the New York Times or National Geographic, potentially a lot of people are going to see those pictures. So you do have some power in shaping the narrative of the story. Now, in the nature of working in this sort of context with these organizations, also, you need to understand that there's a huge machine behind that. There's a lot of discussions between editors and there's, so ultimately the pictures that end up in the magazine or the newspaper might not be the ones that you would necessarily want. Sometimes there's a compromise, other times it's less of a compromise. So I think that you have to be very much aware of this responsibility, and hopefully you need to be as honest as possible with the reality that you're facing and with the story that you're covering, and just to be as sort of as good as possible in terms of telling really the truth, and I know that these days truth is also a word that has lost a little bit of meaning, but I still believe that we need to bring back the importance of facts and the importance of truth, and I think that objectivity and honesty can also sort of go hand in hand, and perhaps not be sort of, they shouldn't cancel each other.
Yeah, honesty, I think, is more realistic for us to aspire to than objectivity, because when you're honest, I think, personally, I feel you serve the story. But anyways, I'm going to wrap up. We are unfortunately out of time, but Moises, before we stop, a few people are asking me where they can get the book and what the name of the book is. The book that we showed is called Discordia, and people want to know where they can get it.
So the book is sold out, and I will try. I mean, you can find some on eBay and Amazon, but the price is gone crazy. So I would not recommend. I'm going to see if I can find. I heard recently that there's a bookshop that still has a few copies in the UK, and I will try to get that information to you guys, and maybe you can disseminate that.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Moses, and thank you, Sarah, for taking us on a wonderful, personal, and inspiring professional journey. And it's quite remarkable that you're sharing with us such an amazing work in the way that you've captured and you've brought to the fore, not only news material, but, human stories that we can all feel very touched by, and it's humanitarian issues that is important for all of us. So I'd like to thank you a lot for joining us tonight and for such an engaging and an amazing conversation.